On this week's episode of Faith versus Culture, could younger Americans be turning against explicit content in TV and movies? We'll have that coming up next.
To have a sex before you marry is a bad idea.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence.
That just depends on your definition of when life begins.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, welcome to this week's episode of Faith versus Culture. I'm Goins-Phillips and joined by Dan Andros, our managing editor at CBN Digital. And, talking about overly sexualized content in Hollywood and the fact that the tide might be turning, I think is fascinating. We know as Christians that God's word obviously talks about sexuality and how we should regard one another as image bearers and when and how sexuality should be expressed. And Dan, as a parent, having to navigate all of this stuff for yourself, but also as one who has kids, how have you kind of navigated some of this issue?
Yeah, well, we'll get into it throughout this episode, I'm sure, but my short answer is being discerning about what they watch and then training them up to know what to do when they come across questionable content.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I want to welcome in our guest here, Melissa Henson. She's the Vice President of Programs for the Parents Television and Media Council. Melissa, thank you so much for taking some time to talk about this. This is your field of expertise, of course. And there's been some recent data on actually Gen Zers, and they're kind of turning away from this overly sexual, explicit content in TV shows and on movies, on streaming platforms. Before we get into the details really of the conversation about how parents can address this with their kids, could you just break down some of the data in this UCLA survey?
Yeah, it really is fascinating. And this comes from the UCLA Center on Scholars and Storytellers. And they did a telephone survey of Generation Z, as you mentioned, which they're defining as between the ages of 13 and 24. And what they are finding is that the majority of adolescents are expressing a desire for more content centered around friendships or platonic relationships rather than sexual content, rather than content that's about dating or romantic relationships. 47.5%, so almost 50%, said that sex isn't needed for the plot of most TV shows and movies. Nearly as many said that romance in media is overused, which I think is really fascinating because if you look at the content that Hollywood continues to create and distribute and market to teenage audiences, it is highly sexualized. And so for teenagers to say, that's not what we're looking for, that's not what we want to see, is really, really fascinating.
It is, and it's encouraging for whatever the reason might be. And I'm curious as to what you think maybe are some of the drivers for the teens not wanting that content. You mentioned that they don't want it, but what is it driving them? Is it a move towards purity, or is it just we're getting so oversaturated that they're just kind of sick of it?
I think it's the latter. And the reason I suspect that is because there was another survey question where they were asking about online dating. And they said 44% of Gen Z said, quote, "I would rather clean the toilet than go on another online date." Yeah, it's funny on the surface of it, but if you scratch the surface a little bit, think about the fact that Gen Z is growing up in the age of Tinder, right? These are kids who are not learning how to date in any kind of organic way. If you're married, you probably met your spouse, at a social function or maybe in school and got to know each other on an emotional and intellectual level before you got to know each other on an intimate level, on a physical level. And for a lot of Gen Z, it's the exact opposite, because Tinder kind of encourages this hookup culture where you're getting to know each other on a physical level before you get to know the person. And so I think that probably what's going on here is this is a bit of a reaction against our hypersexualized culture.
Yeah, well, and I think too, when you look at just the arc of entertainment, when we were mostly consuming TV shows on cable channels, there are regulations in place, right, as far as what you can show in a TV show and what you can't show, because particularly after certain hours or before certain hours, because there it could be any number of people watching at any different age or any different age demographic. Can you talk just about some of that history of how Hollywood has changed and become more explicit over time?
Sure. Well, if you think back to the early days of television, there was the TV Code of Conduct, which stipulated, if you had two characters on a bed, at least 1 foot had to be touching the floor. You think about I Love Lucy, and they were married, but they slept in twin beds. So that was typical of what you saw on television going into the 1970s. I think probably the Brady Bunch might have been one of the first TV shows to actually show a married couple sharing a bed together, but certainly there was no intimate content, no nudity or sexual content that needed to concern parents on the Brady Bunch. But then, and then you go into the 1990s and beyond, there was a little bit more sexual innuendo, certainly on television programs, but it was still largely implied rather than being explicitly shown. So, you think about even Friends. Everybody's talking about Friends this week in light of Matthew Perry's death, but they didn't actually show intimacy on screen. They might show characters in bed with the sheets pulled up, and so there was stuff that was implied and suggested, but it wasn't shown in any kind of graphic or explicit terms, and that was considered a pretty racy show in its day. But as you mentioned, on these streaming services, there are no broadcast decency guidelines sort of holding them in. And what we are finding, and in fact, the PTC just did a study on this very recently, there's almost 300% more mature rated content on these streaming services than there is content that's suitable for family viewing. And what we are finding is that very often on these mature rated shows, they are very explicit, and the level of explicitness rivals anything that you would have seen on, HBO. Think about programs like Game of Thrones, which was reputed to have had such graphic content, explicit sexual content, nudity, and so forth. And what you're seeing now on Netflix, on Amazon Prime Video, on Max, on all of these streaming services is certainly comparable to what you would have seen on HBO.
One other factor at play here, and this would kind of be like a negative reason for why these teens are realizing that, the sexual scenes aren't necessary for the storylines, which I completely agree with, by the way. There really is no justification for actually showing, like you said, in a graphic nature, other than maybe an implied thing that might be critical to a storyline as something that happened. But with the rise of the availability of pornography and all these different accounts of people that are doing streaming services that are sexual in nature, I wonder if because that's so readily accessible, that now it's caused them to realize, well, I don't want that. I'm getting that over there, or people can get it over there. We don't need it over here. So that wouldn't be a good reason, but I'm just wondering if it is a reason.
I think that's probable. I think it's pretty likely. I think kids these days are hyper aware of sex and sexuality in ways that previous generations weren't. And I remember, just a couple of months ago reading an article I thought was bizarre. They were talking about why Gen Z won't wear sandals. They don't want to wear any kind of footwear that exposes their toes. And I read the article. I was like, that's very strange. I never thought about that. And what they were saying is that these kids are so aware of foot fetish videos existing on the internet. Right. I didn't even know that was a thing until I was an adult. But now, you've got 12-year-olds who are not only aware that it exists, but they're worried about people looking at their feet in a sexual way.
Wow.
So they feel like they need to keep their feet covered. It's kind of scary.
Yeah, it is. I was today years old when I found out about that. Jeez, goodness.
Yeah, I think it reminds me of things I've heard even Billie Eilish, the pop singer, say about why she wore baggy clothes when she first started her career is because she didn't want her body as a teenager, really at the time, to be overly sexualized. Which is, it's good that she was modest. It's heartbreaking that the motivation for her modesty was because she was afraid of how she was going to potentially be sexualized by other people. Of course, modesty is a good standard, but the motivation there, I think, is kind of sad. So, but it's important to talk about these issues, right? And to talk about Hollywood and entertainment and the ways that sexuality is kind of permeating our culture. And there's so much here to continue to talk about. So we're going to take a quick break on this episode of Faith versus Culture, and we'll be right back to continue the discussion after these commercials. Well, welcome back to this episode of Faith versus Culture. I'm joined by our managing editor at CBN Digital, Dan Andros, and then Melissa Henson with the PTC. Melissa, before we get into some maybe practical steps of what parents can do to safeguard their homes and protect their children, I know something that I'm interested in, and I'm sure something our viewers would be interested in, is just to learn a little bit about you, why this is something that you are passionate about, why this is something that you've dedicated your career to addressing and kind of advocating for.
Well, I am a mother of a 15-year-old son. And so for me, this is personal. But even before I was a mother, I was working for the PTC. And I think the experience that convinced me of how important this was, we didn't have super strict rules in our household, but there was just this sort of sense of we shouldn't watch this because it's inappropriate, or dad might disapprove. So like Three's Company was off limits. Soap operas were off limits, and I never really had much interest. So I guess on a certain level I was pretty naive, because we mostly watched old black and white TV shows and old black and white movies, and so I was pretty naive about how bad modern media had gotten. But when I was in college, I was working with public schools, the local public school system. They have this extended day program, so if you're a working parent and you're not able to pick your kid up at 3:00, they can stay at school for a couple of hours until you're off of work, and you can swing by and pick them up. And I remember this third grade girl came in and announced that she wanted to be a prostitute when she grew up because her family had watched the movie Pretty Woman the previous weekend. And,
Wow.
For a third grader, that looks like a pretty good life, expensive cars and jewelry and fancy clothes. And it looks like a good life. Now, I assume she didn't really fully comprehend everything that is implied with that. But it was shocking to me that her parents said, this is a good choice for our third grader to be watching this movie. That really shocked me. And it convinced me that, quite often people are not thinking through the ramifications of the media choices that they make, or what they allow their children to indulge in, and how it might be shaping their worldview.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And parents need to be more discerning. I mean, you just can't allow the culture to raise your child. I mean, even if you watch this stuff, you at least need to train them up so that they're looking at things and considering what they're seeing versus what the Bible tells them about life, so you can at least have a conversation about that. So, but in light of that, what are some healthy boundaries that parents can set?
Well, we live in a hyper-connected world these days, and the ubiquity of personal mobile devices. I've spoken to some parents who have told me that in their child's school, your hall pass, it used to be a piece of paper, or sometimes the teacher would give you something ridiculously large and embarrassing to carry down the hall so everybody knew you were going to the bathroom. But these days, your hall pass is on your cell phone. Or if you're involved in extracurriculars, sometimes they want your kid to be on a cell phone so they can participate in the group chats. And I think we need to be pushing back against these expectations, whether it's coming from coaches or, school teachers or school administrators. wherever these expectations are coming from, that your kid needs to have a phone by the age of 12 is ridiculous. And I think that the message to parents needs to be delay, 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 delay as much as you can. Maybe when your kid is driving, there's a good justification for them to have their own cell phone. But before the age of 16, I think it's really important to push back on those expectations. And, if there's a group chat, say the group chat will go to my phone and I will inform my child of what they need to know. You're going to give my kid a paper hall pass if he needs to go to the bathroom or the nurse's office. And just push back on those expectations, limit the number of devices in the home. And if, the genie's already out of the bottle and you've already given your kid that cell phone, make them turn it into you at the end of the day. Keep a charging station in the mom's and dad's room, and all the phones go into mom's and dad's room overnight so that they're all being charged there. There are also apps that you can put on your phones. I know Bark is one that is a good tool for families so that you can find out if people are sending your child inappropriate messages, inappropriate content, if they're looking at YouTube videos that might have questionable content. So take advantage of the tools that are out there and available to try to limit your child's exposure. And the other thing that I think is so crucial is, I mentioned the study that we did earlier that showed the lack of family programming across these streaming services. But when you do consume media, I think it's important to make it a family activity, because what's tending to happen in the modern world is, Junior goes off and plays video games in his room, and the daughter goes to her room and she's scrolling through TikTok, and maybe mom and dad are in the living room watching the news, and everybody's in their separate corners and nobody's communicating. And our kids are going through a mental health crisis in this country. By some measure, 3 out of 5 kids in America today, teenagers in America today, are suffering some form of mental health crisis. And a lot of that, I think, stems from feelings of isolation, feelings of loneliness, and we can go a long way toward mitigating those feelings of loneliness by helping them to feel more a part of the family. And that means spending more time together as a family and finding activities that you can do together as a family, rather than just having everybody go off and do their own thing on their own screens.
Yeah. I think your anecdote about the pretty woman, I think really paints a good picture, because I think a lot of times we're taking in content and it's not necessarily intentional, right? The motivations might have been benign. It was, they just didn't think about it. They should have obviously thought about it before they expose their elementary age kid to a film with these kinds of themes in them. But I think more often than not, and I'm guilty of this too, is I'll watch something and think, well, it's just for entertainment. It's not really having any sort of impact on me. The reality, though, is that it is having an impact. Over time, it's eroding our view of one another, right? If we're watching incredibly sexualized content, it's changing the way we see our fellow brothers and sisters, like male or female. It's changing how we interact with each other. How are you seeing that? Do you see a way that it's breaking down the way we relate to one another when we are consuming constantly this overly explicit content?
Yeah, I mean, there's some really interesting data out there. I mean, there's a phenomenon that's been referred to as the porn gaze, which is exactly what you're describing. A habitual consumer of pornography will tend to look at any woman, every woman, as if he was looking at pornography, imagining what would she look like naked and so forth. And the fascinating thing about it is that the woman on the receiving end of the so-called porn gaze, she can sense that. And I think it probably unquestionably has to affect the way that we interact and the way we engage and the nature of our relationships as brothers and sisters.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, this is such an important topic to discuss, and really we could go on and talk about all kinds of different facets of this conversation, because it is not just something that's happening in our culture, but it's something that's so critical that we learn how to address well as parents, as families, as Christians in our community. So Melissa Henson, thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us about this, and we will be back in just a couple of minutes to wrap this episode up. Well, welcome back to this episode of Faith versus Culture and talking about just overly sexualized content in Hollywood, and unfortunately the ways that Hollywood is, at least so far, not really changing, even though the attitudes on explicit content is changing. Dan, that was a really interesting conversation with Melissa and just breaking down some of the data on research that's been done recently. What are your takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting that the younger generations are turning away from it. That is certainly interesting. I think for me, a big takeaway is that as content increasingly, it's just by nature going to get more and more sexualized, right? You're constantly these creators are trying to push the envelope. They're trying to get your attention. That is the goal of all these content creators, is to get your attention. So how are they going to do that? They're going to have to be more and more extreme. That's the lazy way to do it, right? It's a lot harder to tell a really compelling, really gripping story. So my takeaway is, and as a parent, I've always done this. We just don't watch a lot of TV. We do a lot more reading and things of that nature. And when we do watch stuff, we're very connected with our kids. We watch it together, and we look for things that we can watch together. It's harder work that way. It really is, but it's more rewarding to do it that way. And ultimately, it's going to benefit your kids.
Yeah, well, I think this whole conversation just reminds me that of the reality that sin sells. I mean, as cheesy and maybe cliche as that sounds, that's the reality, right? The more violent things are, the more eyeballs are going to be on it, the more sexually explicit, the more people are going to want to click on it and watch it, because that's our sin nature. That's our human nature to consume this stuff. So I think as Christian families, we have to be really good about safeguarding. And as you said, it is more rewarding when you do these things as a family, right? Because then it can foster all kinds of really good conversation. And if there are maybe some scenes that come up that you want to skip over, or if you see something that was like, I didn't know this was in here, but it's a little bit more risque than I think is appropriate, it opens the door to have conversations with your kids and with your families. So I think there is a lot of benefit to doing this together. It's such an important topic. And like I just said to Melissa, we could talk about it for a long time, but we will be back just in a couple minutes to end this episode of Faith versus Culture. Stick with us. Well, that is all we have for this episode of Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News Channel. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, if you have not subscribed to our daily Quick Start podcast, it's up every weekday morning. Head over to our cbnnews.com website to check that out. As far as this show goes, we will be back next week for another episode. God bless.